How you doing there? Welcome back to Babylon Talmud. Today we're studying Daf Nun Daled, Daf 54 of Masechta Avodah Zarah. Friends, today's going to be a pretty interesting daf, I would say. We got our slides again. Hopefully those are going to be helpful. How'd you like the slides yesterday? Were they okay? Today we have one new type of slides. We're gonna have two of them. It's a Tosfos takeaway slide. A Tosfos takeaway slide, which means that after we have a big Tosfos, there's a slide which is summarizing Al Regalachas. What's the question? What's the answer? So we're gonna have Tosfos takeaway slides today. And anyway, so let's jump in. Well, so what's on the agenda for today? Idolatrous pedestals of kings. Wow. Okay. Well, I guess we'll have to learn about those. Worshipping an animal. I feel like, again, it's funny. I feel like these things are starting to repeat themselves, which is also interesting because as of tomorrow, we're basically wrapping up all the Avodah Zarah stuff, right? It feels like, honestly, I feel like the intro yesterday was also kind of similar in that it was like, the Gemaras that we're going to see, we've actually already seen in other places, but these are the sources for them. So I don't know that we've necessarily seen these exact Gemaras in other places, but I feel like the concept of worshiping an animal is not new. But there are going to be interesting angles here. It's going to be interesting. Yeah, there's going to be interesting things here. Reb Zera, Rava, Tosfos. There's going to be some interesting things there. The difference in action makes. Well, I guess we'll find out the difference that in action makes. Okay, yeah, it's kind of a, abstract thing, but it'll make more sense in context. Swapping Avodah Zarah for an animal. Okay, fine, great. What do you want me to tell you? So if you have Avodah Zarah and you give that to Novi Kovim and he gives you his animal in its place. So what are the halachas around that? And finally, we get to a new Mishnah on Daf Nun Daled Amud Beis Shish. This might be another big daf. It's insane. These dafs have been very big recently. But anyways, we're going to get to a new Mishnah on Daf Nun Daled Amud Beis about different discussions that different rabbis had with philosophers about Avodah Zarah, let's say. And that'll take us to the end of today's daf, and we'll begin with that tomorrow. So without further ado, let us get started here. Okie dokie, wow. So we're going to start at the Mishnah, 2 lines into the wide lines of Nun Gimel Amud Beis, which is kind of crazy because yesterday I think was a super long daf in terms of time, and we actually still have a bunch to do on Nun Gimel Amud Beis. Wow, these dafs have been taking a really long time. They're not huge dafs, but anyways, I guess there's just a lot on them. Okay, so we're going to start at the Mishnah on Daf Nun Gimel Amud Beis, 2 lines into the wide lines. Avodas kachom sheinichua oivdeha b'shas shalom muteris b'shas milchama asur. Okay, so let's do that again. Avodas kachom, Avodah Zarah, sheinichua oivdeha, that was abandoned by its worshippers. Those who worship the Avodah Zarah just abandoned it. So if it's b'shas shalom, if it's a peaceful time, there's no reason why, if these worshippers were going someplace, they it's not like they were b'chipazon, like the Yidden when they left Egypt. That's b'shas shalom. They're leaving at their leisure. So the fact that they left their Avodah Zarah, that their Avodah Zarah was not important enough that they should take it with them, so Memele, they were Mavatal Avodah Zarah, it's mutter. B'shas milchama. But if it's in wartime, right, what is it? Makalchem biadechem no, I don't know, whatever. B'chipaz, like when the Yid left Egypt. I don't know why I'm talking about that. The point being, if it's b'shas milchama and they had to run from home and just take whatever they can, and they left the Avodah Zarah there, they couldn't take it with them. Well, that's not an indication that they're mavatal Avodah Zarah. They just push it. They had to run. So therefore, So therefore, asur, the Avodah Zarah is still asur. The fact that it was abandoned is no indication that it's unwanted by its worshippers. Simply, B'shas Muhammad, the worshippers had to run, and they just simply couldn't take the Avodah Zarah with them, but it's still asur. Bimusios, shel milachim, the pedestals of kings, these are permitted mipnei shmamidin osa b'shasha melachim ovim. The pedestals of the kings are mutaros. They are not asuros as Avodah Zarah. They're permitted. B'pnei shmamidin osa b'shasha melachim ovim, because they erected them when the king is passing by. The Gemara is going to try to understand. Like the Gemara is going to ask, why does that make them not Avodah Zarah? So we are going to talk about that. I imagine what these pedestals are, I don't know, everybody can, I guess, imagine their own thing. I was thinking about making a slide with a photo of what I'm imagining, but I didn't think that it was significant enough that it mattered, or the way that I envision it is necessarily correct, or the only way to envision it. So everybody can use their own imaginations. I'm imagining some kind of a road with these almost like Roman pedestals, and on top they would put an idol. And we'll get into more details in a few minutes, but these pedestals that they erect for the king when he walks by, they are not Avodah Zarah. And the Gemara is going to explain why. So now says the Gemara, Amar Yirmiyah bar Abba Amar Rab, says Yirmiyah bar Abba the name Rab, Beis Nimrod, Harei Kavodas Kocholim. Beis Nimrod, what does it say? Harei, where am I? Beis Nimrod that Beis Nimrod is considered like Avodah Zarah that was abandoned during peacetime, and it is therefore not Avodah Zarah, it is mutter. Says Rashi, what's Beis Nimrod? Migdal shebanu dor aflage la'avodas kochom v'Nimrod haya melech aleim. The Migdal Bavel at the end of Parshas Noach, and it says, right, so right, Hava nivne no lanu Migdal v'rosha bashamayim, something like that. And then, of course, that didn't work out. And it says there in Rashi, it says, V'Nimrod haya melech aleim, that Nimrod was their king. So it says the Gemara, let's read that again. Amar Yirmiyah bar Abba Amar Rav, Beis Nimrod, that the Migdal Bavel be'etzim, Harei kavodas kochom shenichu avdei b'shas shalom u'muter. It's considered like Avodah Zarah that was abandoned during peacetime, and therefore it is not Avodah Zarah, it is permitted. I mean, even though you might be thinking, wait a second, are we talking about that story at the end of Parshas Noach, when the Rabbanu Shalom mixed up and jumbled all of their language, and I think Rashi says, one guy says, give me a hammer, the other guy says, what, you want me to knock you on the head with a hammer? Okay, pop. And then they all just was completely dysfunctional, and they got scattered, and it was a whole big mess. That sounds like Shas Milchama to me. However, even so, Ibaya the Mahadar Hadar Midulai Hadar Batule Batla. However, they could have always come back, right? Nobody's preventing anybody from where was it. I think the Torah even says where it was. I think it was like the land of like Shinar or something like that. If anybody wants to go there, go there. Go. But nobody did. So Mamela, it wasn't important enough to them. Okay, so now we get to kind of the first item that was listed on today's daf. The idolatrous pedestals of the kings. Here we go. That these pedestals of the kings are permitted. The Mishnah had explained why these pedestals are permitted, and the answer was because they are erected when the king walks by. And that is why they are mutarin. The Gemara says, why is that a reason for them to be permitted? That sounds like it could be a good reason for them to be forbidden. That when the king walks by, they erect these pedestals with Avodah Zarah and he worships them. This sounds to me like they should be forbidden. This is Pshat in the Mishnah. The thing is, the thing is, they're kind of casual, they're kind of disposable. Meaning, the king goes down the path, and I think the concept of these pedestals are that, well, when you have these galichs for Avodah Zarah, these priests for Avodah Zarah, and they want that the king, when he passes by, should worship their getchke. So they want that when the king passes by, they'll have these pedestals set up with their Avodah Zarah on, and it'll bow down to the Avodah Zarah, it'll be really good. The thing is, sometimes the king, right, this isn't a path that the king always goes down. This could be a path that sometimes it goes down, but he might choose to go a different way. So the whole nature of these pedestals, they're a little bit iffy. They're a little bit, not iffy, but they're a little bit disposable in some kind of way, that they would erect them with the knowledge that they're going to be unerected, taken down, moved away. And even when they're put up in the first place, they're like, kind of like, maybe they'll be used, maybe they won't. So it's kind of, it's not kavua enough. It's not established enough, I guess, which is an interesting thing. But yeah, it seems like we're saying that because of the sort of disposable nature of it, it's not considered Avodah Zarah. At least these pedestals, because of the kind of disposable nature of these pedestals, they would not be considered Avodah Zarah. Okay, fine. Now, okay, where is it? Sometimes the king, they don't even go this way anyways. When Ula came from Eretz Yisrael to Bavel, Yosef Abisama Pegima, he went and he was sitting on a damaged pedestal. Omer le Rabbi Yehuda le'Ula. Now Rabbi Yehuda saw Ula sitting on this damaged pedestal, and Rabbi Yehuda says to Ula, but Rav Shmuel Damar Tavayu, that Rav and Shmuel say, Bimus Shenifgam Oser, that a pedestal, even once damaged, is still forbidden. So you can't sit on it and get benefit from it. But and even according to the opinion who holds that we don't worship bits of Avodah Zarah, so if you have an Avodah Zarah that breaks into pieces, even if you hold that those pieces would not be Avodah Zarah, they would be mutter. However, that does not extend to pedestals. The reason why they don't worship pieces of Avodah Zarah is because it's kind of weird, right? The zila be'milsa, it's like, how do I explain? It's like, what's a good way to explain zila? I don't know. What's a good? It's. I feel like I want to say beneath them, but I feel like that's not quite the right word. But like, imagine you're like praying to pieces of a broken idol. It's like, well, Zol is cheap. It's like kind of cheap and, yeah, silly to pray to pieces of an idol that are scattered on the floor. Aval high, but a damaged pedestal, who cares? It's just a pedestal. So therefore, Rav and Shmuel say that a damaged pedestal is nonetheless osir. Omle man yoev lon me afred Rav Shmuel umalinan einon. So this is interesting kind of phrase. Ula says to Rav Yehuda, I understand this phrase is essentially being with all due respect to Rav and Shmuel, meaning, right, it's like no offense, but, I mean, no offense is, I think, a lot more negative than this, but basically, Ula prefaces what he's about to say by saying, and I repeat, Man yoyev lon me afred Rav Shmuel, if only we could have even the ashes of Rav and Shmuel, umal inan einon, and we would fill our eyes with them. Kilu, yes, Rav and Shmuel are the highest of the high. However, Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish say the opposite. Bimus shenifgam mutter, that a pedestal that has been damaged is permitted, I guess, to get hana'ah from, and therefore I'm allowed to sit on it. Because even those who say that when an idol breaks into pieces, it's still asur and it would still be worshipped, that specifically pieces of an idol would be worshipped. So this is the opposite perspective here, which is, since this was an Avodah Zarah that they worshipped as a god, and now it's broken, they're not doing it. They're just going to walk away from it. Walk away from your God. Be mevatel it. Okay, I don't care about you. It's a God. So therefore, even according to Man Da'am, who says that, what does it say? Ovdin l'shvarim, that Ovdei Chom do worship pieces. That's specifically an idol. An idol is a God. They're not just going to be mevatel their God. However, but I mean, pedestals, there's nothing inherently holy or meaningful about a pedestal. It's a tool. So if it gets damaged, who cares? Throw it away, get a new one. So therefore, Ula says, I'm allowed to sit on the pedestals because the pedestal that's damaged is mutter. It's not important anymore. Tanik Abose, Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, and there's taka a brisa supporting Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, bimus shenifga mutter, a pedestal that gets damaged is permitted. Imagine that means permitted ba'ano'ah. Mizbeach shenifgam osur achiyinotetz rubo. However, an altar, a mizbeach that gets damaged, remains osur until most of its stones are demolished. Only at that point does it become permitted, right? So meaning, I don't know what I just said, but mizbeach shenifgam osur, right? A mizbeach, however, that gets damaged remains osur until most of it is destroyed. What's the difference between a pedestal and an altar? What's the difference between a bimus and a mizbeach? Amar Yaakov bar Idi, Amar Yochanan, bimus even achas, that a bimus is just one stone, mizbeach avodim harbe, whereas a mizbeach is many stones. Amar Chizkiah Ma'ikra, Chizkiah says, what is the pasuk? Tosfos points out that Chizkiah was taka the Rebbe of Rabbi Yochanan. So Chizkiah, just technically speaking, is not coming to bring a support for Rabbi Yochanan, his student. He's coming to bring a support for the brisa, which I'd said that a mizbeach only becomes permitted when the majority of its stones are demolished. So Chizkiah Ma'ikra, where do we have a pasuk to say that a mizbeach, once the majority of its stones are demolished, becomes mutter? The pasuk says, "Besumo kol avnei mizbeach kavnei girmenu potzis," that all of the stones of the altar of the mizbeach are like chalk stones or something, all scattered and broken. Lo yakumu Hashem v'chamonim, and then they won't be Avodah Zarah. I'ika ke'avnei girmenu potzis lo yakumu Hashem v'chamonim. Yeah, if the mizbeach gets broken and the stones scattered, so then yes, it will no longer be Avodah Zarah. Ilav yakumu, but short of that, it will still be Avodah Zarah. So we see that by mizbeachs, which are multiple stones, the majority of the stones have to be demolished in order for it to become permitted. Okay, so that was the section about the idolatrous pedestals of the kings. Okay, interesting stuff. And now we get up to the next segment of today's daf, worshiping an animal. Now, as I mentioned in the introduction, worshiping an animal has come up several times, but this is going to be pretty interesting in my opinion, because interesting sugyas come out of it. In exploring worshiping animals, we will discuss the sugya of onis rachmana patre. Very interesting tosfos on that. Yeharig val yavor gidaray shvichas dam Avodah Zarah. Interesting tosfos on that too. So there's going to be some interesting things in this segment of Daf Nun Daled of Masechta Avodah Zarah. Says the Gemara, Tana, it was taught in a brayso, ne'evad shelo also b'shachaveru muter. Oh, okay. If a person worships his own animal, okay, well then it's nevad. So nevad is mutter lehedget, right? As we've learned, that an animal that is worshipped is permitted lehedget, but can't be offered as a korban. It's ne'evad. But that's what is what we would call ne'evad. It's worshipped, and it cannot be offered as a korban. Fine. Now, but v'shachaver mutter. But you can't make your friend's animal usher. You can't just bow down to your friend's animal and now it's considered nevad. No, you can't. To your own animal, you can make it nevad, not to somebody else's animal. V'aminu, but we have a question. Ezu nevad, what's considered ne'evad? An animal that was worshipped and is mutter lehedget, but also legavoh. Kol she'ovdim osa, well, any animal that is worshipped. Ben b'shogeg, whether accidentally. Ben b'mezid, whether intentionally. Ben b'ones, whether forcedly. Uvein b'rotzen, or b'rotzen is be'etzim the same thing as mezid, as Ashi points out. So be'etzim, so a ne'evad animal, there are three scenarios. Regardless of if it, right, meaning these are the three. Regardless of if it was accidental, intentional, or forced. In any of those scenarios, the animal will be considered ne'evad. And what we are going to focus on is the forced scenario. What is the forced scenario? Hi, Otis. Echidami, what's the scenario where somehow there was some forcing involved in worshipping an animal? Lav kigon de onas behemas chavero v'ishtachavelo? Is it not talking about where somebody forcibly takes his friend's animal and bows down to it? Is that not ones? And we're saying that it's considered ne'evad. So on the one hand, we said in a brisa that ne'evad, for an animal to be ne'evad, it has to be your animal. You can't just bow down to your friend's animal and make that ne'evad. But on the other hand, we have another brisa which says that ne'evad can even be be'ones. And what's ne'evad in a scenario of ones? Is it not exactly that scenario that you go to your friend's animal and worship it? And we're saying that it is considered ne'evad? Is that not what's going on here? Rabbi Bar Chome says, lo, no. That's not what's going on over here. No. What ones is bowing down to your own animal. So remember, we had a brisa a minute ago that said, ne'evad is only if you bow down to your own animal. It will not be ne'evad if you bow down to your friend's animal. You can't make your friend's animal ne'evad. And in line with that principle, what is the scenario of ones where the animal would be ne'evad? If you worship your own animal, be'ones, right? We had three scenarios in that, in this second brisa, whether it's b'shogeg, b'mezid, be'ones, whether you accidentally worshipped your own animal, whether you intentionally worshipped your own animal, or whether you were forced to worship your own animal. Again, she'ansu ovdei kuchavim, that ovdei kuchavim came and forced you, and he forced him and he bowed down to his own animal. That is the scenario of ones where it would be considered ne'evad. However, in no scenario can you bow down to your friend's animal and make it a ne'evad. Only your own animal. Maskip lo Reb Zeris. Now Reb Zeris asks a very interesting question. And his question is the following. Onis Rachmana Patre. That is Reb Zeris' question. Onis Rachmana Patre. Let's go back to for a second. As it says, no, what does this mean? So Reb Zeris says, 1 second. Have you ever heard of Onis Rachmana Patre? What does Onis Rachmana Patre mean? That's going to be Tosfos' kasha. Okay. Yeah, how do we even explain Onis Rachmana Patre? Well, Well, how about this? So let's just translate the words. A situation of onus, the Torah makes you potter. So it sounds like the whole thing is, once you delve into Tosfos' kasha, like the whole thing gets kind of weird. But basically, Pashtus in the Gemara is basically Reb Zera is saying, onus rachmana patri. How could it be that if a person is forced to bow down to his own animal, that the animal would now be considered ne'evad? He was onus rachmana patri. There can't be any consequences of a situation of onus. You're potter. The Torah says you're potter in that scenario. So meaning a person was forced to bow down to his own animal, the Torah says, you're potter, don't worry about it. And therefore, what's the Torah saying? The Torah is saying, okay, no big deal, don't worry about it. And therefore, says Reb Zera, must be that the animal is mutter, and there's no issues for the person who bowed down to the animal. He was forced. And then he brings a pasuk by Ones, by Nari Marosa. Right? He brings his proof from support from Nari Marosa that a situation where Nari Marosa was forced into having bia, so she's ptura, because after all it was Ones. It was against her will, and therefore she is not chayavis skila. Fine. So okay, so what did we just say? We want to say that the scenario of Ones, where an animal would be considered nevad, is when the owner of an animal is forced to bow down to his own animal, then it's considered nevad. Reb Zera says, what do you mean? What about onus rachmana patri? If he's forced, then everything should just be putter. Everything should just be allowed and cool, and the animal should be mutter. How could it be that when he's forced to bow down to his own animal, the animal is osir, is ne'evad? If it was be'ones, the animal should be mutter, should be okay. So, Elo Amar Rave, so rather says Rave, Hakol hayu bichlal lo sa'ovdem. Well, look, when it comes to Avodah Zarah, here's what's going on. When it comes to Avodah Zarah, the pasuk says lo sa'ovdem. Don't worship Avodah Zarah, which means don't ever worship Avodah Zarah under any circumstances, even if you are forced. Yareg val yava, give up your life instead. But then the pasuk says, in another pasuk it says v'chai boim, that you have to live with the mitzvahs. You're not supposed to give up your life for mitzvahs. What's the whole point to give up your life? That you have to v'chai boim, supposed to live. We're not going to have a scenario where mitzvahs are going to be the cause of your death. So yotza ones. So v'chayba means that if you are forced, for example, to do avodah zarah, so do the avodah zarah. V'chayba, live by the mitzvahs. Don't. The mitzvahs shouldn't be a reason for you getting killed. V'hadar kasav achmana, but there's a third pasuk. V'lo ischal shem kochi. Do not profane my name. Dafilu ba'ones, even if you are forced, do not worship Avodah Zarah. Give up your life. So okay, it said, what's the deal? On the one hand, we're saying v'chai b'hem, v'lo sheyomus b'hem, right? Don't give up your life, live. But another pasuk says v'lo schalu Hashem kochi, don't profane my name, die. Right? Give up your life instead. So, okay, so that's all. Interesting. So Rava says, how do you resolve this contradiction? Well, they're talking about different contexts. When the pasuk says, "V'chai goyim," worship the Avodah Zarah, don't give up your life for it. That's in private. Tosfos is going to ask a kasha about this, but that's in private. In private, worship the Oivik Chom puts a gun to your head, says, worship Avodah Zarah, worship the Avodah Zarah. Or, in this case, an animal. But if it's in public, well then, even in a situation of onus, even with a gun to your head, don't do it. Don't do it, give up your life instead. And here we have a scenario where the person didn't do that. He bowed down, he was supposed to give up his life, but he bowed down to the Avodah Zarah, and he wasn't allowed to do that, because So by bowing down to the idol, so then, by bowing down to the animal, it becomes ne'evad. It becomes osir. So to get back to our initial explanation, what is the scenario where by ones, where it would be considered, where the animal is considered ne'evad? So says Rava, that's talking about a scenario where a person is publicly forced by gunpoint to worship his own animal, and in that case it would be considered ne'evad. In that case it would be considered ne'evad because he was supposed to give up his life, but he didn't, so the animal is considered ne'evad. Now, interestingly, I mean, this is essentially ones rachmana patra, right? Essentially, what Rava is describing is ones rachmana patra, meaning you have a scenario where it was in public, and Ovi Kachon came, put a gun to his head, said, worship your own animal. So he was supposed to give up his life. He was supposed to give up his life. That's what he was supposed to do, but he didn't do it. He bowed down to the animal. He did the wrong thing. He bowed down to the animal. Nonetheless, Rava agrees. We're not going to stone him now for doing Avodah Zarah. He's ones rachmana patra. When it's a situation of ones, even if you do the wrong thing, when you're supposed to give up your life, right? This guy was supposed to give up his life. Yaharg val yavar, right? Avodah Zarah gila ra'av shvichus dam. Yaharg val yavar was supposed to give up his life. He didn't. He worshipped the animal. So say ones rachmana patra. It was ba'ones. He was forced. He didn't worship his animal because he wanted to. B'mezid, he was forced to do it. And therefore, ones rachmana patra, because he was forced, he's potter, he's not going to be chayiv skila, but the animal is going to be osir. So now Tosfos has a gewaltige kasha. Tosfos' kasha is, what's the deal with Reb Zera? Does Reb Zera not understand how ones rachmana patra works? Does Reb Zera not understand how ones rachmana patra works? I mean, it sounded like Reb Zera was basically saying that, well, because it was ba'ones, like, all good. L'chatchila, if he was forced, l'chatchila, bow down to the animal. All good, everything's waived. The animal's mutter because ones rachmana patra. Does Reb Zera not understand what ones rachmana patra is? Ones rachmana patra is what Rava was describing. That even though he was supposed to give up his life, but he didn't, but because it was ba'ones, he's potter, he's not chayiv skila. That's what ones rachmana patra. It doesn't mean ones mutter l'chatchila. It's not what it's saying. It says ones rachmana patra. That if you were supposed to give up your life, you're supposed to do one thing, but you didn't, but you were under duress, okay, you're potter, you're not going to be chayiv for that. And not only that, one step further, what was the pasuk that Reb Zera brought for it? Right? He says, what did Reb Zera say? Reb Zera said, what's that pasuk? That's a pasuk from Sefer, from, I think that's from Kiseitze, right? Parshas Kiseitze, yeah. It's from Parshas Kiseitze, but it's from Daf Ayin Daled Masechta Sanhedrin. That was Dafka, the pasuk that was brought, where we were learning that Gilui Arayos is one of the Yaharig Val Yavors. Is that Gilui Arayos, whether it's, in this case, Narim or also, Yaharig Val Yavor, you have to give up your life. But the Eved, if she was forced into having bia, so she's potter but the Eved. But this is dafka, a situation of you really do have to give up your life. And we're saying, but okay, for the Nara Lusai Sedover, she didn't, this was not something that she wanted, and therefore she is potter. Even though she, by Gilui Arayos, you need to give up your life, but in this particular case, she's potter because it was against her will. No. So what's the deal with Reb Zera? Who's basically, he was kind of saying that, well, how could the animal be considered ne'evad? After all, it was ones, it should be completely mutter. Does he not understand how ones rachmana patra works? And not only that, it seems like he does understand how ones rachmana patra works, because the pasuk that he's bringing is specifically a b'diavad pasuk, that really you have to give up your life, but if you don't, so then you potter. So how exactly was Reb Zera bringing ones rachmana patra to say that the animal was completely mutter and should it be considered ne'evad? So Tosfos says, look, Reb Zera understands ones rachmana patra the same way that Rava understands ones rachmana patra, which is that, if he was forced to worship his animal, he does need to give up his life. And he didn't. And he's potter for that. The difference where Reb Zarah and Rava disagree is, sure, he's potter. He did the wrong thing, but he's potter. He's not chayiv skila. The question is, what about the animal that was worshipped in the process? Rava says that because he needed to give up his life, but he didn't give up his life, so he's not chayiv skila, but the animal is still going to be aser. Reb Zarah says that no, in a situation of onus rachmana patri, he's not chayiv skila, he's potter, but that also extends to the animal, and the animal won't be considered ne'avad in the opinion of Reb Zarah. So Reb Zarah is saying, look, this is a situation of onus rachmana patri, and in a situation of onus rachmana patri, not only is he potter from skila, but the animal should not be considered ne'avad either. That was right. That was Reb Zarah's question. To which the Gemara says, Rava basically ends up ultimately learning out that no, it's a situation of onus rachmana patri, that's true. But says Rava, even in a situation of onus rachmana patri, since he should have given up his life and he didn't, so he's potter, but the animal is going to be considered ne'avad. So I have here a Tosfos takeaway slide that I have a link to the slides here in the description. So we have a Tosfos takeaway slide, which is just al regel achas. So the question essentially is, does Reb Zarah not understand how onus rachmana patri works? The answer is, he does understand how it works. He just holds that the animal would be mutter, bonus rachmana patri, but Rava disagrees and says it would be considered ne'avad. There's another Tosfos. The second, this is I think the last Tosfos of the day, which is a very important Tosfos, that we learned Masechtas Sanhedrin, which we just quoted a minute ago. We learned Yaharig Val Yavor. The opinion of the Chacham is that there are three cardinal sins: Avodah Zarah, Gila Arayos, and Shfichus Damin. And those three, of course, we know, Yaharig Val Yavor. You have to give up your life for them. And that's even bitzina, even in private. Does Rava not know that? Rava is coming and saying that, well, one person says, V'chai don't give up your life. Another person says, V'chalu, do give up your life. Says Rava, no problem. In private, don't give up your life. In public, do give up your life. But what about the fact that this is Avodah Zarah? It's one of the three cardinal sins. Yaharig Val Yavor. Does Rava not hold of that? The answer is Rava does hold of that, says Tosfos. And we even see that Rava says it explicitly himself in Ksubis. So Tosfos Architecture gives a very interesting answer, which is, look, Rava does hold Yaharig Val Yavor by Avodah Zarah, and he would say that even B'tzina, even in private, you do have to give up your life. What he was saying is, first of all, we saw a few weeks ago, the opinion of Rabbi Yishmael. Rabbi Yishmael, if you remember, does make this binary distinction between private and public. That if it's public, Yaharig Val Yavor, no matter what the aver is, and in private, v'chai b'hem, don't give up your life, no matter what the sin is. He just makes this very binary distinction between private and public, Rabbi Yishmael. So Tosfos says that Rava wanted to kind of give an answer that would also work for Rabbi Yishmael, this kind of distinction between private and public. And what Rava was saying was that in private, you're not going to have the mitzvahs lo saseh v'lo schal shem kodshi. Right? That's only in public. In private, there isn't the mitzvahs lo saseh of v'lo schal shem kodshi, but Rava would still say that there's the mitzvahs essay of b'chol me'odecha afilu notel es nafshecha. There still is mitzvahs essay in private still, that even if it means to give up your life, like of course we know from Reb Akiva. So the Tosfos takeaway is, question, why does Rava say it's okay to worship Avodah Zarah in private when you're forced to do so? The answer is he doesn't. It's more subtle than that. In private, there's no negative commandment. There's no mitzvahs lo saseh in private. However, there's still going to be a mitzvahs essay, a positive commandment of b'chol me'odecha. Okay, Chebet. That was the first answer that we gave for how to understand the brisa that says that by onus, an animal can be considered ne'avad. That's talking about when a person is forced to bow down to his own animal. Now says the Gemara, Amru le Rabbanan, the Rava, the rabbis said to Rava, Tanya de Mesayelach, we have a brisa that supports you. Bimusio sha'ov the pedestals of the kucham b'shas ha'gzeira when it was a challenging time, a challenging period for the Yidden, where Yidden were being forced to be Oved Avodah Zarah. And post ipso facto, right? Post ipso facto, Afal pi shagzer betela, even though now whatever silly decree they had was decided that it was no longer imposed. Osim b'musios lo batlu, but we see that nonetheless those pedestals remain also, because we want to say, because since it was be'onis, it would be considered nevad, even though it was be'onis. So even though they might be potter, but the b'musios are still osir, just like the animal was considered a nevad. Omer lahu, to which Rava responded, that isn't necessarily a hard, fast proof, because imishum ha lo tisayin, that would not actually be a proof, because emer yisrael mumerhu ufalach la biratzin, because I'll say that, well, maybe somewhere in the crowd, somewhere in the bunch who were forced to be Oved Avodah Zarah, maybe there was a Yid who did Averis. He was a mummer. We've learned about mummers. There was a person who did Averis, and he actually wanted to be Oved Avodah Zarah, so maybe it's not necessary. And for him, it wasn't necessarily a scenario of ones, and maybe that's why we're saying that it is also Rav Ashi Omer lo tema Amar. Rav Ashi says, don't say, I will surmise that maybe there was a mummer in the bunch. Ela vada Yisrael muma hava ufalachla biratzon. I mean, definitely in such a scenario where the Ovdei Kochavim are forcing the Yidden to be Oved Avodah Zarah under threat of death, there is certainly going to be somebody in the crowd who says, you know what, I don't need this. I don't need to serve the Rabbanu Shalom. I am serving Avodah Zarah. Of course, there is somebody who's going to have such a thought. After all, he's witnessing all the Yidden being either killed or forced to Avodah Zarah. So you can assume that there was definitely somebody among the group who put his lot in with the Avodah Zarah and worshipped Avodah Zarah b'ratzon, and you can argue that that is why the pedestal is also even after the fact, because it was worshipped intentionally. Chizkiya Omer. Okay, so up until now, Chevra, remember what was our question? Our question was that one brisa says that in order for an animal, right, for an animal to be considered ne'evad, it has to have been worshipped by its own owner. You can only make your own animal ne'evad. You can't make your friend's animal ne'evad. But then we have another brisa that says that an animal that is worshipped be'ones is considered ne'evad. So first we had said, well, doesn't that mean that you're worshipping your friend's animal? You're forcibly worshiping your friend's animal and it is ne'evad? We say, no, it's when you are forced to worship your own animal. But now Chizkiah actually comes and suggests that ones is when you forcibly worship your friend's animal. How can you make your friend's animal ne'evad? So Chizkiah Omer says, Chizkiah, Kigon, for example, Sheniseich lavodis kochavim yayin bein karnel. Well, says Chizkiah, it's talking about where you go to your friend's animal and you libate to an Avodah Zarah between its horns. Okay, so I don't know, there's some Avodah Zarah that you want to libate to, so you go to your friend's animal and you pour wine between its horns, and that makes the animal ne'evad. Maskiflo Rav Ada bar Ahava, I ne'evad hu I bimus ba'amu. Rav Ada bar Ahava says, well, hold up. That doesn't make the animal worshipped. The animal in this case, in this scenario, was a tool for worshipping another Avodah Zarah, right? Meaning, what did we just say? We said somebody wanted to worship a particular Avodah Zarah, whatever it is. And the way that he was going to worship that Avodah Zarah was he was going to go to his friend's animal, pour some wine between the animal's horns, and that's how he would worship that Avodah Zarah. But the animal in this scenario was just a tool. And the animal won't be also as a tool. You're just making it a tool. Elo Amar Rav Ada bar Ahava, rather says Rav Ada bar Ahava, Kigon, Sheniseich lo yayin bein karnel, de ovid ba maise. Oh. So rather says Rav Ada bar Ahava, the scenario that Chizkiah is talking about, where you could make your friend's animal ne'evad, is if it's not just if you bow down to your friend's animal. Bowing down to your friend's animal won't make his animal ne'evad. But if you do something, you don't just bow down to it, but you libate to it between its own horns, and you do something to it, well, that maisa, and that's why we're now getting into this next section of, wait, where am I? The difference in action makes. The difference in action makes. Because in this scenario, even though you can't just if you just bow down to your friend's animal, it won't make it Avodah Zarah. But if you libate to it between its horns and you do something to it, well, then it can become Avodah Zarah. And at that point, it will be considered ne'evad, so it would still be mutter lehedjit, right? But it would be aser lagavoya. B'chiyada also ula, and it's like when ula came, Amr Rabbi Yochanan says, name of Rabbi Yochanan, afal pisha amru, even though they said, Amishtachev lebehemas chavero lo aser, that even though they said that one who bows down to his friend's animal, lo asra, won't make it asr, won't make it nevad, as we said earlier. However, also b'maiseh asra. But if he does something to it, such as we just saw, he libated to it or something, so then it could become asr, could become at least asr lagavo. Amr Rav Nachman says, Rav Nachman to the students, to the people, Poku v'amru le'ula, go and tell Ula, who just said the statement in the name of Rabbi Yochanan about doing a maaseh. Kvar tirgama Ravuna l'shmaitech v'Bavel. Old news. Ravuna already taught us this in Bavel. The Amr Ravuna that says Ravuna hoisa behemas chaver revutza b'fnei avodas kechavim. That if you haven't, your friend's animal was tied up in front of some idol, I guess, and it was going to be sacrificed to that idol, but it wasn't yet sacrificed. If you go and you slaughter it, even right, one simon, there's a trachea and the esophagus, you only slit one of them, even you make the animal usher. How can you make your friend's animal usher? By doing a maaseh. You can make the right by doing a maaseh and slitting the throat, you make the animal usher. Minolan the usher. How do we know that making this maaseh makes it usher? Ilem mikirhanim. If it's from the kirhanim, what does Rashi say? Rashi says, "Inem mikirhanim she ansum malchei Yisrael," that the evil kings of Israel forced the Kohanim lasos kom lavodas kom, forced them to be priests for Avodah Zarah. So here they were forced to do a maaseh, and then they were forbidden, since they were forced to do avodah for Avodah Zarah. They were they were prevented from ever being able to do avodah in the Beis Hamikdash because they did a maaseh. But maybe the reason why they were punished and not allowed to work in the Beis Hamikdash was because they're human beings and they can make their own decisions, and it's a fine. But how do I know that if you do a maaseh with an animal, it would be also? Well, we learned the other day that when the Greeks came to the Beis Hamikdash and they went into and they did Avodah Zarah, I guess, on the Mizbeach, and they used the Mizbeach for Avodah Zarah. So we said in that case, so we said that there is a room in the Beis HaMoked where they have the stones of the Mizbeach there. And the question is, how could they make the Avdei Mizbeach Osir? It's hektish. They can't make hektish Osir. So we want to say, because they made a maaseh, it was different. They used it for Avodah Zarah. But maybe the reason why the stones are not being used anymore, but they're in the office by the Beis HaMoked, is maybe it's like our Papa had said that they were made chulin. Well, we quoted a pasuk from, I think, Yechezkel, that had said that they became chulin. What is this? Yeah, what was that pasuk? Uvau ba pritzim v'chilelua. They made it ba'etzim chulin, and So it wasn't hektish anymore, and they were able to make it, right? They used it for Avodah Zarah. So again, it's not necessarily a proof that the Maisa made a difference. Ve'elo mikalim. Okay, well maybe it's the kalim from who was Chizkiyahu's father? Chizkiyahu's father was, what was his name? I think it was like a three letter word. Kalim asher iznich achaz. There it is. That the vessels in the Beis Hamikdash that Chizkiyahu's father Achaz had used for Avodah Zarah, that the Kohanim reported to Chizkiyahu that they disposed of them, that they buried them, and we used others in their stead. But how could Achaz have made these kelim osir? They don't belong to him, they're hektish. But because Achaz had done a maisa with them, he made them also sochanami came into also by maisa also. So we see here as well that by the animal also, when you do a maisa with the animal, it could be considered nevad, even though it's your friend's animal. That even though we say that if a person bows down to the earth, you won't make it also. However, also, but if he digs pits, vaults, and ditches for Avodah Zarah, I guess those pits, vaults, and ditches would be osir again because he made a maiset. So we see here the difference in action makes that here we have these different scenarios where me'ikar adin, these things shouldn't be osir. You can't make your friend's animal osir. You can't make kelim of the Beis Hamikdash osir. You can't make the earth osir. But if you do a maiseh, you can. Okay, so now we get up to the next section of the second to last section of today's daf, swapping Avodah Zarah for an animal. Very interesting sugya, if you're into it. That if you have an idol and you sell it to or you swap it really, you give it to an Ovid Kechavim, and the Ovid Kechavim instead gives you an animal, that animal is also. So says the Gemara, Shmuel bar Yehuda Amar Rabbi Yochanan, even though they said that somebody who bows down to an animal, loy asrun, does not make it asr, lehedjit, right? Even if it's your own animal, right? It's also the gavoa, but lehedjit it's mutter. However, ason chalif in avodas kechavim. But if you swapped your Avodah Zarah and instead, and in place of it, received an animal, asr, and that animal will be asr. Just Ravin, when Ravin came Omar, he said, Pligu, ba Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yossi, Rabbanan, that actually there's a machlekes between Rabbi Shmuel, Rabbi Yossi, and the Rabbanan here. Chad Omar Chalifin asur and Chalife Chalifin mutar. And one opinion is that yes, if you have an idol and you trade it with an Ovid Kechavim for an animal, that animal will be asur. However, if you then trade that animal for, what would be a decent trade there? You trade that animal for what? What are you trading the animal for? I don't know, a piece of fish, whatever, for fish. You trade the animal for fish, well, that fish, and that fish will be mutter. It doesn't last forever. So I think the point is that obviously the idol that he swapped will still be an idol. The animal that he received for the idol will be asur, and even after he swaps it for the fish, it's still asur wherever it is. But the fish is now mutter. The other opinion is the other opinion is that no, the fish is also asur. And if you swap that fish for a potato, well, in addition to the idol and the animal and the fish being asur, the potato will also be asur. Everything will be asur. My time of the mandama Khalifa Nasurin. What's the reason for the opinion who says that all swaps are all usr? Because the Pasuk says Ve'ayisa chayrim kamau kol sha'atem ahaya mimenu areyu kamau. Says Ve'ayisa chayrim kamau, that anything you are mahaya, anything that you make and swap in its place, all things will be kamau, all things will be like the usr thing, and everything just becomes more and more usr. It's usr, what you swap is for usr, when you swap that, then in addition that is usr, and everything before it's usr, everything's just usr. Ve'idach, the other opinion is Amrikra, the Pasuk says, who? Right? The Pasuk says, Ve'izachim kamau shakis t'shaksenu v'soif t'savenu kicherim, who? Who? V'lo chalife chalifin. The initial swap is usr, the animal is usr, but all subsequent swaps are mutter v'idach. According to the first opinion, hahu mivayle nemute orla v'kilei akarim. Who is coming to exclude orla and kilei akarim, meaning that by Avodah Zarah, meaning according to the first opinion, where we say that all swaps are usr, then what do you do with who, that it is usr? Well, the point is that this applies to Avodah Zarah, but we wouldn't say that all swaps are usr when it comes to orla and kilei akarim, right? So if you have, for example, a fruit from a tree within the first 3 years, shemicharon, that if you sell, let's say orla, and you receive money for it, v'kidesh b'demein, and then you are now mekadesh a woman for it with that money, mikudesh, she would be considered married. Ve'idach, and the one who uses who to say that only the initial swap is usr, but all subsequent ones are mutter. So then how does he know that swaps don't apply to orla and kilei akarim? Orla v'kilei akarim lo tzriche. We don't need to exclude swaps for orla and kilei akarim. Lo tzriche miuto. Da'arvelu avodas kochavim v'shvius shnei ksubin aboin ke'echad v'chol shnei ksubin aboin ke'echad ein melamdin. Because Avodah Zarah and shvius, shmita, are two scenarios where there are swaps, where when you swap, the swap is usr. And whenever we have a scenario where there's a particular halacha by just two scenarios, well then it only applies to those scenarios, not to other scenarios. So therefore, obviously, orla and kilei akarim are swap proof, don't have swapping userness. We know about swapping by Avodah Zarah, as we were just discussing, right? And right in that discussion. So the Shvius dichsiv, and we know by Shvius dichsiv ki Yovel hi kodesh tia lochem, that it says by Shemitah ki Yovel is also a Shemitah year, kodesh tia lochem ma kodesh tofes is dama ve'oser, just like by kodesh, right? So if you have hektish, right, you makdish, you makdish your piano. So now you can't get any enough from the piano, but then you transfer its kedusha onto money. Now the piano is no longer hektish. The money is hektish, and you give it to the base hamikdash. So we see that there is the concept of swapping by hektish. So av shvius tofeses dameh ve'atzura. So also by shvius there is swapping, right? It will be applied to its value. Ima kodesh tofes dameh ve'yotze lechulin, av shvius tofes dameh ve'yotze lechulin. But the Gemara suggests as well, by hektish, that piano, when I transfer its value onto money, the piano is no longer hektish. Would you say the same thing about shvius? That when you transfer, right, that if you, sell shvius, would you say that its kedusha shvius is transferred to the money? No way, no how. Tamalom tihyeh, right? It says Yoveli kodesh tihyeh lochem b'avayosatei, that even though you received money, or maybe even something else, as we're about to see, in its stead, and the swap is usr, but the shvius also remains usr. So lokach beferish shvius boser. Let's say you had some shmita produce, and you swap it for meat, right? You give somebody meat, you give somebody Shemitah produce, and he gives you meat. Elu ve'elu mizbarin bashvius. Well, then the meat also has now kedusha shvius, and when there's the biur bashvius means that you can continue to eat your own produce from your own stores, so long as there's still hefker available for the animals for out in the public. Once there's no longer anything available in the public, so then you can't hoard your own, you can't have your own stores anymore. So basically, when you have to get rid of the shvius, so then you would also, right, when you hit that point with the shvius, then you would also have to do the same with the meat that you have, because it has that kedushas shvius. Lokach bebasar dogim, if he then swaps the meat for fish, yotza basar dichnusu dogim. So by Shemitah, what would happen is that the meat has no longer this Shemitah status, but the fish that you swapped it for does. B'dogim yain yotza dogim nichnas yain. If you then swap the fish for wine, well then the Shemitah status is now transferred to the wine. B'yain shemen, you swap for wine oil, yotza yain v'nichnas shemen. So then the kedusha shvius is now transferred to the oil. Haketzad achron nitbas b'shvius ufi atzmo oser. So we see that each subsequent item takes on the kedusha shvius, and the thing prior to it is no, right, the shvius is released from it, but the initial shvius that was initially swapped, of course, remains shvius the entire time. So according to this opinion, who learns out from who, that by Avodah Zarah, it only applies to the initial swap, but not subsequent swaps. He doesn't need a pasuk for Orla and Kilei Hakerem, because he had said that Shvius and Avodah Zarah, Shnei Ksuvim Ban Kechad, those are two unique cases where there are swaps, but nowhere else would there be swaps. Now, according to the opinion who does need who to exclude Orla and Kilei Hakerem, why? Well, according to that opinion, there is also perspective, right? We had said that Shnei Ksuvim Aboin Kechad ein milamdim. Whenever you have two unique scenarios, when you have something that applies, in this case, swapping to just two scenarios, right? In this case, Shemitah and Avodah Zarah, it applies only to those two cases. You can't apply to other cases, right? For example, if you had something that was only in one place, so then you can make a binyanav and say, well, just like it's in this one place, let's say it's in all places. But when you have something in only two places, it's like, wait, it's just those two places. You can't learn out other places, and therefore, memele, in our scenario, Orla and Kilei Hakerem were excluded. However, there is a perspective on Shnei Ksuvim Aboin Kechad, that by these cases, you can actually apply it to other scenarios, and therefore we have a precedent by Avodah Zarah and by Shemitah that of swapping. So I would say that by Orla and Kilei Hakerem there is swapping. So therefore I need who to say that there isn't swapping by Orla and Kilei Hakerem. Sheesh, that section got a little bit technical there. Okay, and now we're going to wrap up today's daf on a bit of a lighter note. And this is actually an interesting transition. I think it seems, I could be wrong, but I think we're basically done with like Avodah Zarah stuff. Right? It was interesting. Masechta Avodah Zarah so far, we're in the 4th parak. So the first two parakim, there was about like the Yomim Tovim Avodah Zarah. It wasn't like so much about Avodah Zarah itself. And then that was the first parak. And then the second parak we started talking about like Yei Nesech a little bit, Bishul Akum, Gvinas Akum, Pas Akum, all that kind of stuff, beer, that kind of stuff. And then on parakim 3 and 4, we really got into Avodah Zarah, right? Kol Atzlomim. And now, we're just talking about Avodah Zarah and worshiping animals and stuff. But now, this is a Mishnah which is not going to be particularly difficult. It's just like anecdotes about Avodah Zarah. And then we're getting into like Yei Nesech stuff. I think we're basically going to be like in Yei Nesech mode, I think, for the rest of the Masechta. which is kind of interesting. So I think we might be kind of done with like the Avodah Zarah stuff. So I hope you enjoyed that last sugya. So now we're up to the last section of today's daf, discussions between philosophers and rabbis about Avodah Zarah. It says the Mishnah Shalu says a Canaan Romi. So in Rome, they asked the elders, if the Rabbeinu Shalom doesn't like Avodah Zarah, why doesn't he just get rid of the Avodah Zarah? I mean, interestingly, we learned in Masechta Sanhedrin that I would think it was the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, they prayed and the Rabbeinu Shalom did at least get rid of the taifa for it. Amru Loin, so the elders answered, Ilu l'davar she'ein tzarich la'olam bai, are you ovdin? Ayu mevatlo. Look, if it was so easy, he would. But it's not so easy. Why is it not so easy? Well, what are the things that are worshipped? Harein ovdin l'chama, v'la'alevana, v'la'kechavim, v'la'mazalos. The Ovdei Kechavim, they worship the sun, the moon, the stars, what are the mazalos things called? Constellations. The Ovid Olamim Mipnei Hashotim, because of these fools who worship them, the Rebbeinu Shalom is going to destroy the world, get rid of the sun, the moon, etc. Because people decided to worship them. So if it was so easy to just get rid of the Avodah Zarah, sure, but they worship things that are not so easy to get rid of. So Mulayan, so the philosophers, those people in Rome, they asked, and Cain, ye oved davar she'ein tzarich la'olam bo, v'aniach davar she'tzarich la'olam bo. Okay, but I mean the obvious solution there is, well, okay, but still get rid of all like the idols and stuff like that, and leave the sun and the moon. It's akilu, the crucial stuff, leave, but everything else get rid of. So Amuloyen ap anu machzikin idei ovdein shel elu she'omim teidu she'nelos sharei hein lo batlu. Yeah, but it's not so simple, because what happens? Okay, you get rid of all like the cute little idols, and then what happens is all the people who worship the sun and the moon, they say, you see, we told you the sun and the moon are the real deal. Look, your silly little idols were destroyed, but the sun and the moon stayed. You see, they're the real deal. So therefore, destroying the other things, the non-essential things, doesn't really help, because that will just encourage those who worship the sun and the moon to say, you see, we have the real God, so therefore, the Rebbeinu Shalom just lets people do what they do. Says the Gemara, the philosophers asked the elders in Rome, if the Rebbeinu Shalom doesn't want Avodah Zarah, why does he just get rid of it? So the elders, the rabbis responded, look, if they would worship things that the world, right, if they worship non-essential things, so you would get rid of the non-essential things, sure. But the thing is that they worship the sun, the moon, the stars, the constellations. So the Rebbeinu Shalom going to destroy the world because of these fools. Rather, the world goes as it does. And the fools who do silly stuff will get in trouble in due time. So the Rebbeinu Shalom just kind of lives and lets live, and people could do whatever they want. The Racher, alternatively, say a person steals wheat and he plants it. Well, if it's stolen, dinu shelo titzmach, I would think that, well, if a person plants stolen wheat, it shouldn't grow, right? It's stolen. It's something bad. It should be punished, and nothing should grow from that wheat. Rather, the world just kind of goes as it goes. The wheat is going to grow into more wheat. And the fools who did folly, they're going to get in trouble. A third scenario, a person sleeps with his fellow's wife, Dinu shalot tisaber. So she shouldn't get pregnant from that, right? That was a bad thing. It shouldn't be able to lead to a baby. No, rather, everything just kind of goes as it does, and a boy and a girl having bia can lead to a baby. Not only do the Shmendriks make my signet sort of just out in the public. What's his signet? Well, the Rebbeinu Shalom stamps every single person with his signet, and every single person is unique, right? We've learned somewhere that the Rebbeinu Shalom, right? Meaning most people, when they have, right, Bosar Badam, you make a stamp, every stamp is the same, but the Rebbeinu Shalom has one mold, yet every single person is different, and they are basically putting this mold out in the public and profaning it and sleeping with whoever they want. They're making me stamp and sign off on these babies against my will. Philosophers echad, as Rabbi Gamliel, a philosopher asked Rabbi Gamliel, it says in your Torah, it says by Avodah Zarah. I think Taka, it's in this week's Parsha, with this week for me, Parshas V'eschanan, that Hashem is a vengeful God. Why is he vengeful against the worshippers of Avodah Zarah? Why not be vengeful against the Avodah Zarah itself? Amar lo, so Gamliel responds, I will give you a parable to what this is similar to, and you will be able to understand. To a king of flesh and blood, Ben Echad, who had one son, but also a Ben, and that one son, Megadel lo es a keleb, was raising a dog. The lo shem Hashem aviv, and you know what he named his dog? The same name as his father's name. And when the son would swear, Omer Bechaye Kelev Abba, he would swear in the name of my dog father, which was not very respectful, that he was basically comparing his father to a dog and worshipping this dog instead of his father. And when the king heard Al Miu Kois, who does he get upset at? Does he get upset at the dog? What did the dog do? Al Benu Kois, he gets upset with the child. I'm sorry, Al Benu Kois or Al Kelevu Kois, who's he going to get upset with? The child or the dog? Al Benu Kois, he get upset with the child. So Amarlo Kelevata Kore Osa, to which this philosopher responds, wait, so you're basically calling Avodah Zarah a dog? Right? Meaning in the Nimshal, or what Gamliel is saying is that, okay, so you have people who are, you have the people that the children of the Rebbeinu Shalom, and they're serving these idols who are like the dogs. So the philosopher says, you're basically calling Avodah Zarah dogs. Velo, yesh ba mamish. Why are you calling Avodah Zarah dogs? Avodah Zarah is the real deal. Amalo Mara Isa says, no, tell me more. What makes Avodah Zarah the real deal? Amalo. So the philosopher says, well, I'll tell you what makes it the real deal. Pam achas amayfis. One time, naflat leika bireinu. There was a fire in our city. V'nisrifa kol ha'ir, and the entire city was destroyed. Kula. Also beis avodas kechavim lo nisraf, except for one temple of Avodah Zarah. Can you imagine? What are the chances? The entire city was destroyed. The only thing that wasn't destroyed was the Avodah Zarah. If that's not proof, then what is? Amar lo, to which Rabbi Gamliel responds, I'll give you a parable. The Melech Basar V'Dam Shesech Olav Medina, that you have a king and one of his provinces, one of his states was being naughty. When the king goes to battle, is he going to fight against the live people or against the dead people? Obviously, he's going to fight with the ones who are alive, the ones that are causing trouble. not the dead ones. So therefore, yeah, you know why there was a fire in your town? The only thing that survived was the Avodah Zarah? Because the Avodah Zarah is already dead. It didn't need to die, it's already dead. I'm like, Kelevat the Koriosa, Mesat the Koriosa. This philosopher says, wait a second. First you called the Avodah Zarah a dog, and now you're calling it dead? In Cain, you have denim in Olam. Well, if it's a dog, and if it's dead, then why doesn't the Rabban Shalom just get rid of it then? Oh my Lord, the Gemara responds, well, if they would worship things that the world doesn't need, so sure, you would get rid of it. They worship the sun, the moon, the stars, the constellations, the canyons, and the rivers and the canyons. What should the Rabban Shalom just destroy the world because of the fools? And similarly, the pasuk says in Tzfanyo, Asof Osev, what should I just get rid of everything from the world, from the earth? Asif Adam Uveima, should I get rid of man, animals? Asif Oifa Shamayim, birds, V'dagi Ayov, and fish. V'amachshelos is Arishoyim V'gomer. V'chipnesha Arishoyim Nichsholim Boim. You have them in a olam, just because the wicked people fail with them, we should just get rid of everything? They even worship people. Why should I get rid of the people too? So therefore, the Rabban Shalom, he can't just destroy his world just because people decided they're going to worship Avodah Zarah, right? Similar to all rights, like we've been saying, like you can't just make your friend's your friend's animal Avodah Zarah. So you can't just have a few people worshiping the sun. Now the whole world, the sun's destroyed for the whole world. It doesn't work like that. It's therefore everything just kind of stays. Okay. That was the Nun Daled of Masechta Avodah Zarah Shish. I think that was another long one. Woo! Okay, what did we learn today? We learned about idolatrous pedestals of the king. Okay, right? There were those pedestals, and we said that they are taka mutter because the king doesn't really care so much about them. They're basically disposable. We then saw a machlokes about what if you have a pedestal that gets damaged. We saw Rabbi Shmuel said that it remains osir, but Rish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan had said it becomes mutter. We talked about worshiping animals. We said if you worship your own, right? If you worship your own animal, it becomes also, but you can't worship your friend's animal. It won't become usher. But we said that if you we talked about a situation of ones, but we said even the situation of ones, it's dafka your own animal. But we did say, we had the opinion of Chizkiah and Rav Ada bar Ahava, that even if you worship your friend's animal, it can become usher if you do an action such as libate to it between its horns. We talked about the difference in action make, which was kind of a segue from the action kind of thing. And we talked about that if you slaughter your friend's animal for Avodah Zarah, taking that action, you can make it Avodah Zarah. Or we saw that Achaz made the Kalim in the Beis Hamikdash Avodah Zarah, for example, also for example, because he used them. Talked about swapping Avodah Zarah for an animal. You have Avodah Zarah, you swap it for an animal, it becomes Asur. There's machlokes about what about the next, with the next things that you swap for it, do they also become Asur? And then we got to the Mishnah at the end of today's daf, which we're going to continue with at the beginning of tomorrow's daf. Discussions between philosophers and rabbis about Avodah Zarah, and why doesn't Hashem just destroy the Avodah Zarah? He would, but he can't because it's complicated. They so worship the sun, etc. That was daf Nun Daled of Masechta Avodah Zarah. I hope you enjoyed this long but excellent daf. Peace out.